The troubling history of the Moabites leaves us with a powerful question. How far-reaching are the consequences of our actions? Today, I'll reveal who the Moabites truly were and how their decisions led to their portrayal as a morally depraved people in the Bible. But more importantly, we'll uncover timeless lessons from their story, showing us how to avoid repeating their mistakes and shape a better future. Stay with me until the end, because this truth could change your life. Are you ready for the challenge? Let's explore it together. The story of the Moabites is both fascinating and unsettling, revealing the consequences of choices made in moments of moral weakness. Yet, their history offers profound lessons on redemption, pride, faith, and the lasting impact of our decisions. I invite you to journey through the scriptures and discover how the story of this ancient people can provide guidance for our own lives today. Are you ready to reflect on their legacy and what it might mean for you? Our story begins in a dark moment, deep in the shadow of a cave near Zoar. The smoke still lingers from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities consumed by divine judgment. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, finds himself alone with his two daughters, overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty. In this desperate situation, Lot's daughters, convinced they are the last survivors of humanity and desperate to preserve their family line, make a decision that will alter the course of nations. They intoxicate their father and, in an act of incest, conceive children with him, a moment the Bible neither ignores nor justifies, but one that sets the stage for the rise of the Moabites. Let us listen to this passage. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab, as told in Genesis 19:37. Thus, Moab is born, whose name possibly means from the father, a constant reminder of his controversial conception. His brother, Ben-Ammi, the progenitor of the Ammonites, is born in a similar manner. This origin, stained by sin and desperation, could have condemned Moab and his descendants to a fate of shame and rejection. However, the biblical narrative shows us that God, in his infinite mercy, does not reject the Moabites. On the contrary, he allows them to settle and prosper, demonstrating that even from the darkest beginnings, hope can arise. Imagine for a moment the burden that Moab must have carried growing up, knowing the circumstances of his birth. How would he forge his identity? How would he face others' judgments? These questions invite us to reflect on our own origins and circumstances, reminding us that we are not defined by our past, but by how we choose to live in the present. As Moab establishes itself, we see how God allows its people to flourish. The Moabites settle in a fertile land east of the Dead Sea, developing their own culture and identity. This act of divine grace reminds us that God can use even the most unlikely situations for his purposes. It is striking to remember that the story of Moab's origins challenges us to consider how we respond to our own past, whether we let mistakes define us or view them as opportunities for growth and redemption. Do we judge others by their origins or recognize the potential for transformation in every individual? If we transport our imagination to those times, we could say it was a landscape of dramatic contrasts. To the west, the salty, shimmering waters of the Dead Sea stretch like a mirror under the blazing sun. To the east, a plateau rises majestically, reaching heights of up to 1,000 meters above sea level. This is the heart of Moab, a land that God allowed Lot's descendants to inhabit and cultivate. To the surprise of many, the Bible offers glimpses of this rich and varied land. Deuteronomy 2 mentions how God instructed the Israelites, "Do not harass the Moabites or provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land," indicating that he had given the land of Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession. It is worth noting that Moab's geography is a testament to divine providence. The plateau, nourished by more abundant rainfall than the surrounding lowlands, flows into an oasis of fertility in the desert. Imagine vast barley fields waving in the breeze, vineyards laden with ripe grapes climbing up the slopes, and flocks of sheep grazing on green pastures. This abundance did not go unnoticed. The prophet Isaiah, in his oracle about Moab, mentions the vineyards of Sibmah, Isaiah 16:8, famous for their exquisite wine. The Moabite stone erected by King Mesha in the 9th century BC speaks of cisterns and water reservoirs, evidence of sophisticated water management. Moabite cities such as Dibon, Nebo, and Medeba stood as centers of trade and culture, with strategic fortifications guarding the borders and protecting the nation's wealth. Archaeologist Nelson Gluck described Moab as a land strewn with ruins, a testimony to its past greatness. However, this prosperity came at a cost. The land's wealth fostered pride and self-sufficiency among the Moabites. Jeremiah 48:11 depicts Moab as wine settled on its lees, a metaphor for its complacency and resistance to change. The land of Moab invites us to reflect on our own blessings. Do we recognize God's hand in the abundance we enjoy? How do we use the resources entrusted to us? The story of Moab reminds us that material prosperity, without corresponding gratitude and spiritual responsibility, can become a trap. At the heart of Moabite identity lay a spiritual paradox that reflects the complexity of their origins. On one hand, as descendants of Lot, the Moabites had knowledge of the true God. On the other hand, their proximity to Canaanite cultures led them to adopt idolatrous practices that would eventually define their religious identity. The center of Moabite worship was Chemosh, their national god, as Numbers 21:29 refers to the Moabites as the people of Chemosh. This god, associated with war and fertility, demanded sacrifices that sometimes included human lives. Let's recall the chilling account in 2 Kings 3:27, where the king of Moab sacrifices his firstborn son on the wall in a desperate attempt to appease his deity. Imagine the temples of Moab, imposing structures where the smoke of sacrifices continually rose. Priests dressed in elaborate robes performed complex rituals to ensure Chemosh's blessing on crops and armies. On the hills, high places served as open-air sanctuaries where fertility rites were practiced, blending worship with sexual immorality. Archaeology has provided evidence of these practices. The Mesha Stele, a 9th century BC monument, repeatedly mentions Chemosh, attributing military victories and divine favor to him. Figurines of fertility goddesses found in excavations attest to the importance of nature cults. However, the Moabite story is not devoid of encounters with the true God. The episode of Balaam, narrated in Numbers 22:24, is particularly revealing. Balak, king of Moab, hires Balaam to curse Israel, but God intervenes, and Balaam can only pronounce blessings. This incident underscores Yahweh's sovereignty even over nations that do not recognize him. The Moabite religion prompts uncomfortable but necessary questions. What are the Chemosh of our time? What subtle idols have we erected in our lives, placing our trust in them? Just as Chemosh was eventually led into exile with his priests and leaders, Jeremiah 48:7, we must examine how we let our spiritual practices lead us astray. Even amidst this spiritual darkness, we see glimpses of divine grace. The story of Ruth, which we will explore later, shows how a Moabite woman could abandon her people's idols and embrace the God of Israel, becoming an ancestor of King David and by extension the Messiah. The Moabite religion serves as a powerful reminder of how easily we can stray from the truth, substituting worship of the living God with empty rituals or seductive but ultimately hollow philosophies. It challenges us to constantly examine our spiritual practices to ensure we are worshipping the true God in spirit and truth. As you enjoy this video, I encourage you to leave a comment sharing if you know someone or if you have experienced situations related to the uncomfortable question we've raised. What subtle idols have taken root in our lives, whether prosperity or pleasure at the cost of spiritual sacrifices? Your experience may inspire future topics, so feel free to share. Your participation is essential for the growth of our community. Now, the relationship between Moab and Israel is a story of ups and downs, a complex tapestry woven over centuries. This history of neighbors, sometimes allies and often enemies, offers a fascinating window into the geopolitical and spiritual dynamics of the ancient Near East. The first significant encounter between these peoples occurs during the Exodus. Imagine the scene. The Israelites, recently freed from slavery in Egypt, approach the borders of Moab. King Balak, fearful of this numerous and nomadic nation, resorts to extreme measures. This horde will now lick up all that is around us, as an ox licks up the grass of the field, he exclaims in Numbers 22:4. It is in this context that the famous episode of Balaam occurs. Hired to curse Israel, Balaam finds himself unable to pronounce anything but blessings. His oracles, recorded in Numbers 23 and 24, not only predict Israel's future greatness, but also contain one of the most beautiful messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. Numbers 24:17. However, Moab's hostility toward Israel does not end there. In a tragic turn, Moabite women become instruments of temptation, leading many Israelites to idolatry and sexual immorality. Numbers 25 recounts how this seduction provokes divine anger and results in a plague that claims thousands of Israelite lives. This incident leaves a deep mark on the Israelite psyche. Deuteronomy 23:3 states, "No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever," indicating a severe prohibition that God himself would later temper with grace. During the period of the Judges, we see Moab rise as a regional power. Judges 3:12-30 recounts how Eglon, king of Moab, oppresses Israel for 18 years. Liberation comes through Ehud, a left-handed judge who assassinates Eglon in an act of audacity and cunning. This episode reminds us that God often uses unexpected methods and unlikely people to achieve his purposes. The era of the Israelite monarchy brings new chapters to this tumultuous relationship. King Saul battles against Moab, 1 Samuel 14:47, but it is David who establishes a more complete domination. An intriguing detail emerges in 1 Samuel 22:3. David, fleeing from Saul, leaves his parents under the protection of the king of Moab. Could this gesture indicate distant familial ties, perhaps through his great-grandmother Ruth the Moabite? David's subjugation of Moab is brutal. 2 Samuel 8:2 describes how he measures Moabite prisoners with a cord, determining who will live and who will die. This shocking image reminds us of the harshness of ancient warfare and challenges us to reconcile the violence in the Old Testament with our understanding of a God of love. After the division of the kingdom, Moab alternates between periods of subjugation and rebellion. 2 Kings 3 describes a joint campaign by Israel, Judah, and Edom against Moab that ends in a macabre stalemate when the Moabite king sacrifices his firstborn son. This act of desperation causes the Israelites to withdraw, filled with anger, perhaps towards Moab themselves, or even towards a God who permits such horror. As the power of the Israelite kingdoms wanes, Moab regains its independence only to eventually fall under the control of larger empires such as Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. The prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah against Moab are gradually fulfilled, and the once proud people fade from history, absorbed into other cultures. The relationship between Moab and Israel raises deep questions about national identity, inherited prejudices, and the possibility of redemption. It invites us to consider how we treat those we consider other, how we balance justice with mercy in our interpersonal relationships and between nations. Amidst the tumultuous history between Moab and Israel, a story of love, loyalty, and redemption emerges as a beacon of hope. The book of Ruth transports us to the time of the Judges, a period of chaos and moral decline in Israel. Imagine an Israelite family, Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons, forced by famine to seek refuge in the land of Moab. The irony of their situation is striking. Descendants of those who were once slaves in Egypt now seek sustenance in the land of an ancient enemy. In Moab, Elimelech's sons marry local women, Orpah and Ruth, but tragedy strikes as Elimelech and his sons die, leaving Naomi and her daughters-in-law widowed and vulnerable. In an act of sacrificial love, Naomi urges her daughters-in-law to return to their families in Moab. Orpah, with a heavy heart, obeys, but Ruth refuses to abandon her mother-in-law, declaring words that have resonated through the ages. "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God, my God." Ruth 1:16. Ruth's declaration is more than a promise of familial loyalty. It represents a profound spiritual conversion, a rejection of the Moabite gods, and an acceptance of the God of Israel. It challenges us to consider if we are willing to leave behind the familiar, even what we once considered sacred, to follow the truth when we find it. Naomi and Ruth's return to Bethlehem marks the beginning of a new chapter. Ruth, the Moabite foreigner, finds herself gleaning in the fields of Boaz, a distant relative of Elimelech. The Mosaic law required farmers to leave the corners of their fields unharvested for the poor and the foreigner, Leviticus 23:22, a practice that now benefits Ruth. Boaz, impressed by Ruth's devotion to Naomi and her willingness to work hard, treats her with kindness that goes beyond what the law requires. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Ruth 2:12. The story of Ruth prompts us to ask how we treat foreigners in our communities. Are we willing to look beyond labels and stereotypes to recognize each individual's inherent value? How can we, like Boaz, go beyond the minimum requirements of the law to show true kindness and generosity? With the establishment of the monarchy in Israel, relations with Moab enter a new phase marked by more intense conflicts and periods of subjugation. This era provides valuable lessons about power, politics, and the consequences of national arrogance. King Saul, the first monarch of Israel, includes Moab among his conquests. 1 Samuel 14:47. However, it is with David that we see a dramatic shift in the power dynamics. 2 Samuel 8:2 presents a disturbing image. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a cord. He measured 2 cords to put to death and 1 full cord to let live. The Moabites became David's subjects and brought tribute. This brutal action raises uncomfortable questions. How do we reconcile this act of apparent cruelty with the David we know as a man after God's own heart? It reminds us that even the most revered biblical figures were complex human beings, capable of both great faith and questionable actions. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. There was great anger against Israel, so they withdrew and returned to their own land. 2 Kings 3:27. This desperate act of the Moabite king Mesha leaves us stunned, reflecting the depth of idolatrous devotion and the desperation of a besieged people. The Israelites' reaction to withdraw in anger suggests a deep discomfort, perhaps a recognition of how far things have gone. As time progresses, we see Moab alternating between periods of subjugation and rebellion. During the reign of Jeroboam II in Israel, Amos prophesies against Moab, suggesting it still posed a threat or at least a concern for Israel. Amos 2:1-3. Finally, with the rise of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, both Israel and Moab lose their independence. Jeremiah 48:36 mentions Moab among the nations that must submit to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, as part of divine judgment. This era of conflict and subjugation offers enduring lessons: the danger of national pride, the futility of violence as a long-term solution, the generational consequences of sin, and the sovereignty of God in history. Despite apparent chaos, God continues to work out his will through nations. How do we apply these lessons to our modern world? What responsibility do we have as individuals and nations to break cycles of violence and seek reconciliation? As the story of Moab draws to a close, Israelite prophets raise their voices to pronounce divine judgments against this nation. These prophecies are not mere predictions of destruction, but warnings filled with spiritual and moral significance. Isaiah dedicates 2 whole chapters, 15 and 16, to Moab. His oracle begins with a vision of devastation. An oracle concerning Moab. Ar of Moab is ruined, destroyed in a night. Kir of Moab is ruined, destroyed in a night. Isaiah 15:1. The vivid description of destroyed cities and widespread lamentations paints a picture of imminent judgment. However, amidst this darkness, Isaiah offers a glimmer of hope. Send lambs to the ruler of the land from Selah across the desert to the mount of the daughter of Zion. Isaiah 16:1. This enigmatic verse has been interpreted by some as an invitation for Moab to submit to the God of Israel, suggesting that even in judgment, the door to mercy is not completely closed. Jeremiah in chapter 48 offers the most extensive prophecy against Moab. His message is a mixture of judgment and lament. Dibon has gone up to its temple, to its high place to weep. Moab wails over Nebo and Medeba. Every head is shaved and every beard cut off. Jeremiah 48:1. The prophet clearly identifies the reason for the judgment. Because you trusted in your deeds and your riches, you too will be taken captive, and Chemosh will go into exile together with his priests and officials. Jeremiah 48:7. Moab's trust in its own strength and false gods is the root of its downfall. This warning resonates through the centuries, reminding us of the dangers of self-sufficiency and idolatry. Yet even amid this severe judgment, Jeremiah concludes on a note of hope. "Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in days to come, declares the Lord." Here ends the judgment on Moab. Jeremiah 48:47. This promise of future restoration reminds us of God's mercy, which transcends even his most severe judgments. Other prophets, such as Amos, Zephaniah, and Ezekiel, also pronounced judgments against Moab, generally in the context of oracles against Israel's neighboring nations. These prophecies underscore common themes: pride as the root of national sin, the futility of trusting in false gods and human alliances, the certainty of divine judgment, and the possibility of restoration for those who turn to God. These prophecies challenge us to examine our own lives and societies. What do we place our trust in? How do we respond to divine warnings in our own lives? The prophecies against Moab are a powerful reminder that God is the Lord of all nations, not just Israel. They invite us to a broader view of history and divine purpose that encompasses all humanity. The decline and eventual disappearance of Moab as an independent nation is a gradual process unfolding over several centuries. This process not only fulfills the prophecies pronounced against Moab, but also offers deep lessons on the long-term consequences of national decisions and God's faithfulness to his word. The first significant stage of this decline occurs with the rise of the Assyrian Empire around 732 BCE. Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria invades the region, subjugating Moab along with other Levantine nations. This event marks the end of Moab's true independence, though it maintains some autonomy as a vassal state. The Mesha Stele, a Moabite monument from the 9th century BCE, provides insight into Moab's resistance against the foreign nation. In it, King Mesha boasts of his victories over Israel and the restoration of lost territories. However, this resistance would ultimately prove futile against the advance of more powerful empires. With the fall of Assyria and the rise of Babylon, Moab faces new pressures. The book of Jeremiah shows Moab among the nations that must submit to Nebuchadnezzar. "Now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and I have given him even the beasts of the field to serve him." Jeremiah 27:6. The final destruction of Moab, as a distinct political entity, likely occurred during Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns in the region around 582 BCE, fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecies about Moab's fall. "The calamity of Moab is near at hand, his affliction hastens swiftly." Jeremiah 48:16. After the Babylonian era, Moab effectively disappears from historical records as an independent nation. The region is absorbed by successive empires, Persian, Hellenistic, and eventually Roman. The Moabite population gradually mixes with other ethnic groups, losing its distinctive identity. Archaeology offers fascinating evidence of this decline. Excavations at sites like Dibon and Nebo show signs of destruction and abandonment that coincide with the period of Assyrian and Babylonian invasions. Moabite material culture, once distinctive, gradually merges with the traditions of surrounding peoples. The fulfillment of the prophecies against Moab raises profound questions. How do we interpret divine judgment in history? The fall of Moab was not a sudden event, but a gradual process unfolding over generations. What responsibility do nations have for their collective decisions? Moab's fate was partly the result of its own political and spiritual choices. How do we balance divine justice with mercy? Even amid judgment, we see glimpses of hope and promises of future restoration. The disappearance of Moab as a nation reminds us of the fragility of earthly powers and the importance of building on solid spiritual foundations. It challenges us to consider the legacy we are leaving as individuals and societies. The story of Moab, from its contentious beginnings to its eventual disappearance, offers deep and relevant lessons for our modern world. The danger of national pride, the excessive confidence of Moab in its own strength, the importance of spiritual integrity, the generational consequences of our decisions, and the possibility of individual redemption. How can we foster healthy patriotism without falling into arrogance? What are the idols in our current society that divert us from solid ethical values? How can we make decisions today that benefit future generations? The story of Ruth shows that even in adverse circumstances, individuals can choose a path of faith and love. How can we encourage that same openness and compassion in our communities? Despite apparent chaos, God continues to work out His will through nations. How can we maintain hope and faith in turbulent times? The danger of judging based on origins or labels is evident in Israel's tendency to prejudice based on origin. How can we overcome our own prejudices and see the inherent value of each individual? The importance of historical memory. Understanding the history of Moab helped Israel grasp its own place in God's plan. How can we use the study of history to gain perspective on our current challenges? These lessons invite us to a deep reflection on our own lives and societies. How can we apply the wisdom derived from the history of Moab to create a fairer, more compassionate, and spiritually centered world? As we conclude our journey through the history of Moab, we find ourselves in front of a mirror that reflects not only the past, but also our present and future. The question with which we began resonates even more strongly. Can our actions determine the future of our generations? The answer, as we have seen, is a resounding yes. Every decision we make, every value we uphold, every act of kindness or selfishness contributes to shaping the world that our descendants will inherit. What legacy are you building today? What story will future generations tell about our time? The choice, as always, is ours. Do you feel like you are fighting against obstacles that seem impossible to overcome? The Israelites faced similar challenges against the Moabites, and their stories teach us valuable lessons for our own lives. I invite you to stay with us to explore these biblical stories in depth. Additionally, I suggest watching our video on the Amalekites, where you will learn more about how to confront these internal struggles. Subscribe now, and may God bless you abundantly.